in the London crowd all my life. It's my family. I love its energy. I love its momentum. When I'm in the crowd, I'm no longer myself. I'm part of a force that's inhabited this city for 2,000 years.
London feeds on its people in its endless appetite for power and profit. As the city grows ever larger, so do its crowds. In the 18th century, London became the largest city in the world. It was a rushing centre of commerce, and its population doubled by the end of the This population boom was fueled not by an increase in birth rate, but entirely by London's powers of attraction. It drew people to it, to feed its commerce and its crowds. London was being transformed into the heartless vortex of humanity which came to haunt Thomas de Quincey.
You become aware that you're no longer noticed. Nobody sees you, nobody hears you. You do not even regard yourself. How should you? Poor, shivering unit in the aggregate of human life.
The London crowd shapes and is shaped by the city. The 18th century novelist and magistrate Henry Fielding observed the way the city's streets seem to encourage the violence and crime that lurk just beneath the surface of the great metropolis.
Whoever considers the great irregularity of London's buildings, the immense number of its lanes, alleys and courts, must think that they had been intended for the very purpose of concealment. The whole city appears as a vast wood or forest in which the thief may hide in as great security as wild beasts do in Arabia and Africa.
For Fielding, the confines of the city itself could render its people fierce and desperate. London has always been a city filled with resentment and simmering fury. But only once has the city been engulfed by its people. For 6 days in the June of 1780, the Gordon riots raged unchecked through the streets. This is the story of the London crowd and how it has threatened to destroy the city that created it. In London, a mysterious energy emerges when a group of people come together. And if you were looking for the London crowd in all its theatrical glory, there is only one place to begin. Bartholomew Fair.
Bless me, deliver me, hold me! The fair! Now the place is Smithfield, the grove of hobby horses and of trinkets, and the wares are the wares of the devil! But the fair is the shop of Satan!
It was a place of buying, selling, eating, drinking, gambling, whoring, of freak shows and street theatre. For the people of London, it represented a few days of liberty from the unrelenting burden of city life. Bartholomew Fair was held here in Smithfield, just outside the old city walls. It began in the 12th century and flourished for hundreds of years. It was a place of misrule where the London crowd could indulge all of its appetites. Bartholomew Fair was the essence of London's vulgarity and disorder. Bartholomew Fair turned the world upside down. Servants and masters could be found getting drunk at the same gaming tables. All social distinctions were erased in its crowds. The fair seemed to intensify the predatory nature of London. It was considered to be a threat to public order, and the city authorities made regular attempts to close it down. But the spirit of Bartholomew Fair is the spirit of London itself. Its spectacle and theatricality survive to this day in the Notting Hill Carnival, where the London crowd still takes possession of the streets to indulge all its appetites. In Smithfield today, at a place still known as Pie Corner, the image of a golden boy hugging his belly stands as a warning against gluttony.
The fair was an assault on all the senses and appetites of the crowd. From the eating houses and stalls here on Pie Corner, there came the smell of cooking. It was the smell of seared flesh, roast pork.
The spectacle of the London crowd intent on pleasure has always astonished and bemused outsiders. The 18th century journalist Ned Ward wrote a satirical account of the fair through the eyes of a naive visitor from the country.
A swinging fat fellow, the overseer of the roast, who was standing by the spit in his shirt, rubbed his ears, breast and neck and armpits with the same wet cloth which he applied to his pigs, which brought such a qualm over my stomach, I had much ado to keep the stuffing of my guts from tumbling into the dripping pan. We deferred our eating to a cleanlier opportunity.
The Smithfield crowd has always been drawn to the smell of roasting flesh. In the 16th century, this was the site of the public burnings of religious martyrs. During the reign of Queen Mary, one John Ashton, who was found illegally eating pork during Lent, was burnt to death facing the west door of St. Bartholomew's Church. The crowd assembled to jeer and absorb the spectacle. For hundreds of years, Smithfield's everyday business was as the chief livestock market of London. Known as Ruffian's Hall, Smithfield was crowded with people as well as livestock. It had a reputation for chaos and cruelty, for its stench and brutality, as vast numbers of animals were driven into the heart of the city to provide fuel for its ever-growing population.
Smithfield Market has been feeding the London crowd since the 12th century. It is still London's largest wholesale market. This place has always been heaving with flesh, with life and with death.
When Charles Dickens was a boy, he was fascinated and repelled by the Smithfield crowd.
It was market morning. Countrymen, butchers, drovers, hawkers, boys, thieves, idlers and vagabonds of every low grade were mingled together in a mass. The crowding, pushing, beating, driving, whooping and yelling, the hideous and discordant din that resounded from every corner of the market, and the unwashed, unshaven, squalid and dirty figures constantly running to and fro and bursting in and out of the throng, rendered it a stunning and bewildering scene.
Dickens saw London itself as a vast theatre, a sequence of scenes played out between the overbearing city and its crowds. Londoners loved all kinds of shows, but if there was one character who came to represent the anarchic energy of the London crowd, it was Punch. His great belly, big nose, humped back and long stick made him the embodiment of a gross sexual joke which appealed to the lewd tastes of the London streets. He was violent too.
Mr. Punch, where's my rent?
By the middle of the 18th century, Punch had become a genuine Cockney hero. He's the essence of London's disorderly spirit. It is no surprise that he ends up in prison, the destiny of so many others from the London streets.
London has often been described as a prison. It's dark, overcrowded, claustrophobic. It's a place where people have laboured and died for thousands of years. And the most hated symbol of the city's authority was the most terrible prison of them all, Newgate.
The Central Criminal Court, known as the Old Bailey, now stands on the site of Newgate Prison. The prison was originally built into a gatehouse in the old Roman wall. It was one of the thresholds to the city, and because it contained those condemned to die, it also became a gateway between this world and the next. Charles Dickens understood its power as a symbol of life and death for the London crowd.
There, at the very core of London, in the heart of its business and animation, in the midst of a whirl of noise and motion, stemming, as it were, the giant currents of life that flow ceaselessly on from different quarters and meet beneath its walls, stands Newgate. And in that crowded street on which it frowns so darkly, within a few feet of the squalid, tottering houses, upon the very spot on which the vendors of soup and fish and damaged fruit are now plying their trades, scores of human beings have been hurried violently and swiftly from the world.
In the imagination of Londoners, Newgate became associated with hell. It produced utter degradation, an air so foul that it infected the neighbourhood. Lice and bedbugs teemed in such profusion that the floor crunched as you walked. It was a city within the city, run as a private business, with prisoners paying for their accommodation, enmeshed in a web of tips and bribes. The wretched crowd that filled Newgate fascinated the crowd that filled the streets outside. It fed a fashionable culture of criminal celebrity, which reached its peak in the 18th century.
Criminals have always had an especial place in the heart of the London crowd. From Dick Turpin, the highwayman, to the Cray brothers, ordinary Londoners have embraced those who set themselves outside the law. That's why Newgate Prison has produced some of London's most memorable heroes.
A thief and highwayman called Jack Sheppard escaped from prison 6 times, twice from Newgate, and became a London celebrity. A century later, poor London children who had never heard of Moses or Queen Victoria still knew the legend of Jack Sheppard. His hanging at Tyburn attracted the largest crowd the city had ever seen. The condemned approached execution with all the attention to detail of a star turn, and the audience was guaranteed. Hanging days were public holidays in order to encourage the London crowd to take to the streets for the spectacle. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands opposite the site of Newgate Prison. It too had a part to play in the unfolding drama.
At midnight, on the eve of an execution, a bellman would walk along the tunnel connecting the church with the prison, tolling this handbell and reciting, "All you that in the condemned hold do lie, prepare you, for tomorrow you shall die. And when St. Sepulchre's bell in the morning tolls, the Lord have mercy on your souls."
London's ritual of punishment ended with a procession. The holiday crowd pressed in around Newgate and lined the streets as the convicted men and women were taken through the city in an open cart, up Holborn Hill, west towards Tyburn. The procession halted at the aptly named Resurrection Gate by St Giles in the Fields, now in the shadow of Centrepoint, where the condemned were given bowls of ale to comfort them on their final journey. Some were repentant, others stopped on the way for several final drinks, and were almost insensible by the time they reached the scaffold. Officers on horseback were needed to restrain the crowds who cheered or booed their heroes or villains as they passed. It was customary for famous London criminals to wear white cockades in their hats as a sign of triumph or derision, or occasionally even of their innocence. Tyburn was an area of open fields well beyond the city, near where Marble Arch now stands. The young Scotsman James Boswell, on his first trip to London, couldn't resist its gruesome attraction.
I read so much in The Lives of the Convicts about Tyburn that I had a sort of horrid eagerness to be there. Accordingly, I got upon a scaffold very near the fatal tree so that I could see all the dismal scene. There was a most prodigious crowd of spectators. I was most terribly shocked and thrown into a very deep melancholy.
The noise and confusion were immense. Wooden galleries were erected around the area as if they were stands at a racecourse. When the corpses were cut down, there was a general rush to touch them. The bodies of the hanged were believed to have healing powers.
The Murder Act of 1752 was intended to increase the terror of the death penalty by giving up the corpses of convicted killers for public dissection by anatomists.
The populace often come to blows as to who will carry the corpses to the relatives who are waiting in coaches, for the carriers are well paid for their trouble. You see most amusing scenes between the people who do not like the bodies to be cut up and the messengers the surgeons have sent for the bodies. Blows are given and returned before they can be got away.
Such regular outbreaks of violence led to the banning of the hanging parades in 1783, when executions were transferred to the streets outside Newgate. The writer Dr. Johnson was among those who mourned their passing.
Dr. Johnson told me, "The age is running mad after innovation. Tyburn is not safe from the fury of innovation. Sir, it is not an improvement. Executions are intended to draw spectators. If they do not draw spectators, then they do not answer their purpose. The public is gratified by a procession, the criminal supported by it. Why should all this be swept away?"
The answer lay in the way London was growing and in what it was becoming. The hanging parades were stopped because their disorderly crowds offended the sensibilities of those who lived in the newer, smarter western parts of town, like Mayfair. Georgian London was changing shape and changing style. It was a beast with two heads, split between the rich and poor, the old city to the east and the new West End.
The rich and the fashionable fled the narrow streets and crowds of the city. The West End was born in a frenzy of speculative building. It produced neat, uniform townhouses and a new pattern for civilized living, the London Square.
The principle behind the squares was to create an oasis of calm away from the turbulent crowd. They were designed as centres of small communities, each with their own church and market. Their regularity and uniformity have the air of old monastery cloisters or convent gardens. They have become London's great gift to the development of cityscape. But they didn't remain models of civic harmony for long. The London crowd, with all its mess and degradation, flowed into every new space. No one could live apart from it. People soon complained that St. James's Square had become a receptacle for all the dead cats and dead dogs of Westminster. London is unimprovable and unstoppable. By 1750, the capital was home to 10% of the population of England. Foreign visitors were intrigued by the novelty and theatricality of London street life. There was nothing like the glitter and amenity of the West End to be found anywhere else in the world.
In Oxford Road alone, there are more lamps than in all the city of Paris. Shops seem to be made of glass.
And through the streets, there surges a bustling, thrusting crowd, such as our busiest boulevard gives no idea of.
I have just reached London. It is terrifying. It is mad. London is the grandest and most complicated monster on the face of the earth.
But the city was also an inspiration. Few could resist the theatre of its streets. James Boswell described his rising excitement on being driven along the Haymarket for the first time.
I was full of rich imagination of London, such as I could not express to most people, but which I strongly feel and am ravished with. My blood glows and my mind is agitated with felicity.
The city was endlessly stimulating, but it wasn't rank or nobility that drove London. It was money.
Covent Garden.
Giacomo Casanova was a churchman, soldier, diplomat and spy, as well as a notorious libertine. When he first visited London in 1763, he immediately grasped the city's founding principle.
In London, everything is easy to him who has money, and is not afraid of spending it.
The second thing that struck him was the disrespectful nature of the London crowd.
A man in court dress cannot walk the streets of London without being pelted with mud by the mob. They hoot the king and the royal family when they appear in public, and the consequence is they are never seen.
Georgian London aspired to elegance, but it was in reality chaotic. The natural arena for this typically London mingling of high and low, where the crowds of the East met the crowds of the West, was Covent Garden. But it hadn't always been that way. The Palladian-style church of St. Paul's is a clear sign of its aspirations. Its piazza had been the very first square in London, intended for a highly select group of aristocratic town dwellers. But as the better sort continued to move westward, the neighbourhood declined.
Punks, madams, jilts, doxies, smuts, cracks, trulls, trogmouldies, bunters, does, punchable nuns, moles, mackerels and cats. The whores of London had 100 different nicknames, but whatever you called them, they were all available in Covent Garden.
The old London of Smithfield and Bartholomew Fair, with its crowds and its vices, had reasserted itself.
I must tell you about the lewd hussies who are everywhere. Every 10 yards one is attacked, even by children of 12 years old. They attach themselves to you like limpets. Often they seize hold of you in a fashion of which I can give you the best notion by the fact that I say nothing about it.
As Covent Garden came alive at night, it turned into a sexual marketplace. The nearest equivalent today is Soho, a few streets to the west. In a city of trading and selling, the poor had nothing to sell but their bodies. They serviced a precisely calibrated machine of supply and demand. There were public houses where posture dancers performed an 18th century version of striptease. There were houses of pleasure which specialized in flagellation. And there were molly houses which were frequented by homosexuals. Anything and everything was available. For Boswell, the teeming city was an aphrodisiac.
At the bottom of Haymarket, I picked up a strong, jolly young damsel, and taking her under the arm, I conducted her to Westminster Bridge. And then, in armour complete, did I engage her upon this noble edifice. The whim of doing it there with the Thames rolling below us aroused me much.
Endlessly theatrical itself, Covent Garden has always been London's theatre district. And the theatre was where the disorderly London crowd was at its very worst. In the name of public order and decency, the Licensing Act of 1737 attempted to control the number of theatres and the plays that were performed. But it couldn't do anything about the behaviour of the London audience. Despite the efforts of actor-manager David Garrick to woo a more respectable public, the Drury Lane Theatre was wrecked by riots 6 times in just over 30 years. Nothing seems to have channeled the latent violence of the London crowd more than the theatre. Rival gangs packed the theatres in order to support or shout down the latest productions. Fights would break out, which frequently developed into riots. It became so dangerous that a row of sharp iron spikes was set along the front of the stage in order to protect the actors from the London mob.
At the theatre there was already a vast crowd of people, all struggling like wild beasts, as usual in England. The theatre was literally stormed. They clambered onto the benches behind the backs of the people on the seats. Prostitutes forced their way through every loophole. The chatter never stopped, and there was some fighting.
The fury of the crowd could be sparked by the smallest provocation. Casanova was at Drury Lane one evening when Garrick's decision to change the programme led to the theatre being gutted by the mob. He also witnessed Garrick's humiliation when the theatre reopened.
When Garrick appeared, 1,000 voices took up the cry, "On your knees! On your knees!" He had to kneel down and beg forgiveness. Then came a thunder of applause and everything was over. Such are the Londoners.
The end of the play was the start of the real drama, when the crowd was back upon the streets. The threat of pickpockets or worse was ever present. It was said that at night in Covent Garden you couldn't walk the few hundred yards between the Rose Tavern and Button's Coffee House without risking your life. Twice. Since the Middle Ages, the enforcement of law and order in London had been haphazard, the responsibility of individual parishes. Night watchmen, or Charlies as they were known, were notoriously vulnerable to gangs of drunks or roarers. The growth of London demanded more effective measures of control. In the 1750s, the novelist and magistrate Henry Fielding established in his own house here in Bow Street a police office which acted as a kind of headquarters for the suppression of London crime.
I had the most eager desire of demolishing gangs of villains and cutthroats. So, I had a set of thief-takers enlisted into my service, all men known, approved, faithful, and intrepid.
These Bow Street runners were also known as Robin Redbreasts or Raw Lobsters because of their red vests. At first there were only 6 of them for the entire city.
Fielding realised that London had become an urban jungle, a lawless wilderness of crime and violence, and it was getting worse.
The growth of London led to severe overcrowding in its maze-like streets. Too many people in too small a space engendered strange fevers and excitements, an undifferentiated mass of common human beings who posed a threat to order and security. And nowhere was more crowded than the parish of St. Giles. St. Giles was the intercessionary saint for beggars and cripples. In the 12th century, this was the site of a leper hospital set amid marshland. Here stands the Resurrection Gate, where the condemned paused on their final fatal journey to Tyburn.
In the parish of St. Giles, there are a great number of houses set apart for the reception of idle persons and vagabonds who had their lodgings there for 2d a night. Here, men and women, often strangers to each other, lie promiscuously, the price of a double bed being no more than 3d. In one of these houses were found 58 persons of both sexes, the stench of whom was intolerable.
This is a haunted place. The 60s tower block, Centre Point, stands on the site of what were once the worst slums in London's history. In its time, it too has been a shelter for homeless people, and vagrants still gather in its shadow. This area has always been the haunt of the poor and the outcast, the crowd of the forgotten. But in Georgian London, there was a new predator in this urban jungle, one which would be responsible for the deaths of many thousands of Londoners. Gin.
A new kind of drunkenness, unknown to our ancestors, is lately sprung up amongst us, and which, if not put a stop to, will infallibly destroy a great number of the inferior people. The gin shops are filled with men and women, and even sometimes of children, who drink so much that they find it difficult to walk on going away.
The London crowd's appetite for gin seemed to threaten the very fabric of society.
For half a century, gin was the demon spirit of London. It took possession of the people. In the 1740s, there were 17,000 gin houses in the city. The rage for gin erupted like a frenzy, as if the city itself had been seized by a sudden fever and a burning thirst.
On Sunday evenings, 500,000 men and women with their children flood like a sea over the whole city, where till 5 in the morning they celebrate the Sabbath. That is to say, guzzle and get bestially drunk for a whole week.
The artist William Hogarth's famous engraving Gin Lane was set in the parish of St. Giles. There is no more brutally accurate depiction of gin as the crack cocaine of its day. The drunken mother, her expression one of oblivion beyond despair, letting her baby slip to its death, is nothing less than a case history a woman called Judith Defour strangled her 2-year-old child for the price of its baby clothes, to spend the money on gin. Gin rendered the London crowd more unpredictable and uncontrollable than ever, and there was always the fear that it might become vicious. When George I came to the throne in 1714, he immediately passed the Riot Act. Like Fielding, he knew that the city authorities were powerless against the crowd.
When a mob of chairmen or servants or a gang of thieves or sharpers are almost too big for the civil authority, what must be the case in a seditious tumult or general riot?
In the modern city, with its ever-present police surveillance, it's difficult to imagine the unchecked ferocity of 18th century Londoners, most of whom were ready and willing to express their loyalties in the theatre of the streets. Old animosities ran deep, particularly against foreigners and Catholics. It was said that there were 10,000 Londoners ready to die for the cause against popery, even if they weren't sure whether it was a man or a horse. The crowd could be whipped up to support almost any cause or settle any score.
In an atmosphere of political and religious controversy, there was no civic authority and certainly no police force to restrain it. It was the rampant political animal at the heart of the city. It was the mob.
The word mob was coined as a new name for the London crowd after a Pope-burning procession in 1680. On that occasion, an effigy of the Pope was stuffed with live cats before it was paraded through the streets.
Under Section 14 of the Public Order Act, you may hold an assembly here for the next 2 hours.
The Riot Act was intended to be the ultimate weapon of control against the mob, but it had little effect. Throughout the century, there were riots attacking the Irish, riots on behalf of the weavers, riots in defence of cheap gin, riots during almost every election meeting. Each riot had its target, but the target was never London itself. Despite this history of turbulence, the mob has never taken control of the city. But during the Gordon riots in the summer of 1780, it came dangerously close to doing so. It all began when Lord George Gordon organised an anti-Catholic march to Parliament. His supporters were described as the better sort of tradesmen, but no crowd in London remains unmixed for long. Ignatius Sancho, who kept a grocer's shop a few hundred yards from the Houses of Parliament, was an eyewitness.
At least 100,000 poor, miserable, ragged rabble from 12 to 60 years of age with blue cockades in their hats, besides half as many women and children, were all parading in the streets, the park, the bridge, ready for any and every mischief. The shouts of the mob, the horrid clashing of swords, and the clatter of the multitude in swiftest motion drew me to my door, where everyone else in the street was employed in shutting up shop.
The crowd marched in a column 4 miles long, carrying banners declaring no popery. When they converged on Westminster, they raised a great yell.
The heat inflamed them as they invaded the lobbies and corridors of Parliament. They threatened to burst into the chamber when a report spread that armed soldiers were coming.
The crowd was ejected from Westminster, a few were arrested and taken to Newgate, but the rest of the city was theirs. The contagion of the crowd's disorder spread like a fever. A fragile equilibrium had been upset, and violence and looting, fires and destruction broke out all over the city.
I am not sorry I was born in Africa. 1,000 madmen armed with clubs and bludgeons set off for Newgate to liberate, they say, their honest comrades.
That night, the sky above London turned to the colour of blood. 36 major fires were started. The prisons of the Fleet, the Clink and the King's Bench were alight. The mobs unleashed their anger on the prisons because they understood that London was a prison.
That was why it was inevitable that they should finally take their vengeance against Newgate itself. More than 300 prisoners were liberated. Some were escaping imminent execution and were like men resurrected. A bonfire was lit, and every stick of prison furniture was burnt. It was an exorcism. The keys to the jail were paraded at the end of a pole, emblems of the prison's bad magic.
The mob didn't stop there. There were unseen centres of energy, unseen swirls of activity. It stalked through the streets like some phantom or monster. It was out of control, but it chose its targets with unerring accuracy.
The greatest losses have fallen on the great distiller near Holborn Bridge and Lord Mansfield, the Lord Chief Justice. The former has lost his whole fortune, and the latter, one of the finest law libraries in the kingdom. Shall we call it a judgment? The thunder of their vengeance has fallen on gin and law, the two most inflammatory things in the Christian world.
The mob was finally confronted when it attacked the Bank of England in the very heart of the city. Here, the army and the volunteers of the London Military Association stood their ground and opened fire. The next day, the military were in control. It is estimated that more than 700 people lost their lives. There was no firm conclusion on the causes of the riots. They were compared to a discharge of lightning, a grounding of the energy of the city. It was the bloodiest rebellion of its people in London's history. The city had come closer to being demolished by its own crowd than at any other moment, before or since.
But London didn't fall. It never does. It is too large and too complex to be moved by riot or by mayhem. The London crowd is powerless in its presence. Stony-hearted and unyielding, it wavers slightly and then continues on its relentless course.
Peter Ackroyd is braving the deadly underworld of 19th century London, and he's landed another coup to make journalists green with envy. He's interviewing Engels, Conrad and T.S. Eliot. That's coming up next on UK TV History.